The Battle of Narva in 1944 unfolded against a backdrop of shifting fortunes on the Eastern Front. Following the catastrophic defeats of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and Kursk, German forces had been forced into a broad retreat westward. By early 1944, the Soviet Union had regained much of the territory lost in 1941-42, and the Red Army prepared to carry its offensives into the Baltic region. Estonia, with its strategic position on the Gulf of Finland, became the next objective. The capture of Narva would provide the Red Army with access to Tallinn and the Baltic coast, threatening to cut off German Army Group North from retreat routes to Latvia and Lithuania. For Germany, holding Narva meant preserving the northern flank of the Eastern Front and securing access to the Baltic ports vital for supplies and communication with Scandinavia. For the Soviet Union, capturing Narva would not only secure Estonia, but also open the path to breaking German defenses across the Baltic region. The stakes were both strategic and symbolic. The front represented the narrowing of German power in the east and the growing momentum of the Soviet counteroffensive. One of the distinctive features of the Battle of Narva was the multinational composition of German defensive forces. Alongside regular Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions, the German command deployed units made up of volunteers from across Europe. The 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division, Nordland, largely Scandinavian, and formations including Flemish, Dutch, and Belgian contingents were integrated into the German order of battle. The German leadership presented this as a European crusade against Bolshevism, portraying Narva as a symbolic defense of Europe's eastern frontier. Propaganda emphasized the presence of foreign volunteers to reinforce this image, though in reality, these formations were heavily subordinated to German command structures. The Soviet side was represented by the Leningrad Front, commanded by Marshal Leonid Govorov. In early 1944, the Red Army had already lifted the siege of Leningrad and sought to exploit its momentum by pushing west into Estonia. The Narva Isthmus, a narrow corridor between Lake Peipus and the Gulf of Finland, offered both opportunities and challenges. Its geography made it a natural defensive position for the Germans, but it also served as a gateway for Soviet forces into the Baltic. Soviet preparations included massing artillery, armor, and rifle divisions for a series of assaults designed to break through German lines by weight of numbers and firepower. Public sentiment in Estonia was deeply divided. Some Estonians saw the German presence as an occupation, with forced mobilization into Waffen-SS formations creating resentment. Others, motivated by opposition to the Soviet regime that had annexed Estonia in 1940 and carried out mass deportations, viewed cooperation with the Germans as the lesser of two evils. This division shaped both military recruitment and civilian attitudes throughout the battle. For the Soviets, the liberation of Estonia was framed as part of the broader restoration of Soviet sovereignty, though many locals feared the return of Stalin's repressive policies. By January 1944, the stage was set. Soviet forces numbering over 12,000 prepared to attack German positions around Narva, where Army Group North fielded around 5,000 to 6,000 troops, including the multinational Waffen-SS contingents. The battle would last for months, characterized by repeated Soviet offensives and determined German defense, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. It became one of the defining engagements of the Baltic theater in 1944, encapsulating not only the military struggle between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, but also the political and cultural dimensions of a war fought on contested ground between great powers and smaller nations caught in their shadow. The opening phase of the Battle of Narva began in early 1944, immediately after the lifting of the siege of Leningrad. The Soviet Leningrad Front, commanded by Marshal Leonid Govorov, turned its attention westward. Its objective was to force German Army Group North out of Estonia and secure access to the Baltic Sea. The Narva Isthmus, with its narrow strip of land between Lake Peipus and the Gulf of Finland, became the focal point of this advance. Soviet command believed that a concentrated assault could break through German lines quickly and open the way to Tallinn. On the 14th of January 1944, the Soviets launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, a massive operation involving more than 1 million men along a broad front. In the sector leading toward Narva, the Red Army concentrated approximately 23,000 troops, supported by more than 1,500 artillery pieces and several hundred tanks. Their immediate goal was to overwhelm the German defensive screen east of the Narva River. The Germans, however, had foreseen the Soviet push. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, reinforced the sector with the 3 SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Felix Steiner, which included Waffen-SS units of diverse European origins. The Soviet advance quickly gained momentum. By late January, forward elements had reached the outskirts of the Narva River line. Soviet spearheads forced crossings of the Luga and approached the critical rail hub at Narva. The Germans, outnumbered and pressed by continuous artillery barrages, withdrew in stages, falling back toward prepared positions along the Narva. Civilian populations in eastern Estonia were caught in the path of advancing troops, with many evacuating westward, fearing the return of Soviet administration. On the 2nd February 1944, Soviet troops attempted their first direct assaults on Narva. The Red Army committed the 2nd Shock Army and elements of the 59th Army, supported by armor and air units. Their attacks aimed at breaking the German line by sheer weight of men and firepower. The Germans, however, used the terrain to their advantage. The Narva River and its surrounding marshlands provided natural defensive obstacles. SS units, including the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, with Scandinavian volunteers, and the 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, fought alongside German formations to repel the attacks. Casualties on both sides mounted rapidly. During this phase, Hitler personally intervened in the command situation. Dissatisfied with Küchler's handling of the retreat from Leningrad, he replaced him with Field Marshal Walter Model in late January. Model was tasked with stabilizing the front and ensuring that Narva would be held at all costs. His arrival brought stricter discipline and immediate efforts to reinforce the defensive line. Soviet intelligence, however, continued to report that the Germans were overstretched and believed that persistent pressure would eventually force a breakthrough. For the Soviet rank and file, the opening phase was marked by exhausting assaults in harsh winter conditions. Units were often committed to frontal attacks against entrenched positions, leading to heavy losses. For the German and foreign SS troops, the defense became a test of endurance, holding thin lines against repeated offensives. Estonian civilians conscripted into the Waffen-SS were thrown directly into some of the heaviest fighting, while others fled or tried to avoid forced mobilization. By the end of February 1944, the Soviets had established several bridgeheads across the Narva River, but the German line remained intact. Both sides had suffered thousands of casualties, and the battle entered a prolonged phase of attrition. What Soviet planners had hoped would be a rapid breakthrough was turning into a drawn-out contest, as the Germans clung to the Narva positions with multinational forces, framing their defense as a stand not only for Germany, but for Europe against Soviet expansion. The opening phase thus set the stage for months of brutal combat, where neither side would easily yield ground. The strategic goals and planning behind the Battle of Narva reflected both the broader war aims of Germany and the Soviet Union in early 1944, and the specific constraints imposed by geography, resources, and political circumstances. For the Soviets, the offensive was part of the larger Leningrad-Novgorod operation, launched in January 1944 to end the prolonged German presence near Leningrad and to exploit the Red Army's growing superiority in manpower and material. For the Germans, holding Narva became a test of their ability to stabilize the northern sector of the Eastern Front and protect Army Group North from encirclement or collapse. From the Soviet perspective, the objectives were clear. After lifting the siege of Leningrad on 27 January 1944, Stavka ordered Marshal Leonid Govorov's Leningrad front to continue westward. The immediate aim was to seize Narva, which guarded the gateway to Estonia. From there, the Red Army could advance toward Tallinn and Riga, threatening to isolate Army Group North from its lines of communication with Germany and the rest of Europe. By cutting off the Baltic states, the Soviets would not only regain their pre-war borders, but also deprive Germany of access to key naval bases along the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. The longer-term objective was to collapse German control in the region entirely, opening the way for Soviet reoccupation of the Baltic republics. Operational planning on the Soviet side relied on numerical superiority. Govorov's Leningrad Front, supported by the Second Baltic Front to the south, concentrated roughly 12,000 troops for the Narva sector. These included the 2nd Shock Army, the 59th Army, and supporting tank brigades. Artillery and rocket launcher regiments were massed to create a firepower advantage, while the Soviet Air Force provided air support. Logistics were organized around the railways radiating from Leningrad, which had only recently reopened after the end of the siege. Supply convoys moved ammunition and fuel across frozen terrain, though the harsh winter conditions posed constant difficulties. Propaganda framed the Soviet push as the liberation of Estonia and the destruction of German strongholds that had tormented Leningrad for years. Leaflets and broadcasts called on Estonian civilians and conscripts to abandon the Germans, promising the restoration of Soviet order. However, Soviet intelligence underestimated both the determination of German command to hold the Narva Isthmus and the defensive advantages of the terrain. For Germany, strategic goals were shaped by both Hitler's directives and the reality of deteriorating strength on the Eastern Front. By early 1944, Army Group North had been steadily pushed back from its positions around Leningrad, and the retreat threatened to unravel the entire northern sector. Hitler declared Narva a fortified place to be held at all costs. Its location between Lake Peipus and the Gulf of Finland created a narrow front where numerically inferior German forces could attempt to block the Soviet advance. If Narva fell, the road to Tallinn would be open, and the entire Army Group North risked being cut off from Latvia and Lithuania. The German command entrusted the defense to the 3rd SS Panzer Corps under Felix Steiner. This corps was unusual in composition. Alongside standard Waffen-SS divisions, it included foreign volunteer formations drawn from across Europe. The 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland contained Scandinavian volunteers, while the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, was formed largely from Estonian conscripts and volunteers. Additional regiments of Dutch, Flemish, and Belgian volunteers were attached, along with the German 227th Infantry Division and other Wehrmacht elements. In total, the German force at Narva numbered around 6,000 men. German planning emphasized defensive tactics. Steiner's corps prepared strong points along the Narva River, supported by artillery batteries and anti-tank positions. The narrowness of the front allowed the Germans to concentrate their firepower, while swampy terrain and forests limited Soviet mobility. The Luftwaffe committed fighter and bomber squadrons to support the defense, though by 1944 it could no longer guarantee air superiority. German propaganda presented the battle as a European crusade against Bolshevism, emphasizing the multinational composition of the defenders. This narrative sought to bolster morale among foreign volunteers and portray the defense as part of a wider ideological struggle. Logistical challenges plagued the Germans throughout the campaign. Supply lines ran through Estonia and Latvia, heavily dependent on rail transport, vulnerable to Soviet air raids and partisan attacks. Ammunition shortages were frequent, and reinforcements were limited, as most German reserves were committed to the central and southern fronts. The reliance on Waffen-SS divisions with high political visibility reflected both the scarcity of Wehrmacht manpower and Hitler's preference for ideologically reliable units. Finnish interests also influenced planning indirectly. Though Finland was not directly involved in the Battle of Narva, the fate of Estonia was of great importance. If Soviet forces captured Estonia, they could threaten Finland from the south via the Gulf of Finland, increasing pressure on Helsinki to abandon its alliance with Germany. Thus, the German defense of Narva also served to shield Finland from immediate Soviet advances, a factor that contributed to continued cooperation between Berlin and Helsinki in 1944. In intelligence terms, both sides misjudged key aspects of the campaign. The Soviets underestimated the German capacity to regroup and fight effectively after the retreat from Leningrad, expecting Narva to fall quickly. The Germans, conversely, underestimated the scale of Soviet reinforcements and the determination of Stavka to prioritize the Baltic campaign, even while offensives raged in Ukraine and Belarusia. These miscalculations ensured that the battle would evolve into a prolonged and attritional struggle, rather than the rapid Soviet breakthrough or decisive German stand envisioned in planning stages. By February 1944, the strategic goals and plans of both sides had crystallized. The Soviets sought to break through and reclaim Estonia, while the Germans aimed to hold the Narva line with limited resources, relying on terrain, fortifications, and multinational SS formations. The clash of these objectives, shaped by political imperatives and logistical constraints, set the stage for months of fierce combat in which both sides invested heavily, despite the limited geographic scope of the front. The battle would soon escalate into one of the most intense contests of the Baltic theater, with consequences far beyond the town of Narva itself. The first engagements of the Battle of Narva in February 1944 tested both the Soviet determination to advance and the German capacity to defend with limited resources. After weeks of preparation, the Leningrad front launched its initial assaults across the Narva River, aiming to overwhelm the German III SS Panzer Corps and open the road to Tallinn. What followed were weeks of intense clashes, marked by heavy artillery bombardments, costly frontal attacks, and localized counterstrikes that defined the character of the campaign. The Soviet assault began in earnest on the 2nd of February 1944, when the 2nd Shock Army and elements of the 59th Army advanced under cover of massed artillery and rocket barrages. The attacks targeted German positions east of Narva, where river crossings and marshy ground created natural choke points. Soviet units managed to establish several bridgeheads on the western bank of the Narva River, threatening to unhinge the German line. The Red Army committed tank brigades in support, but the swampy terrain and frozen ground limited mobility, causing many vehicles to bog down or become easy targets for German anti-tank guns. The German defense relied heavily on Waffen-SS formations. The 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, composed largely of Scandinavian volunteers, played a central role in repelling assaults. Alongside them, the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, recently formed and only partially trained, was thrust directly into combat to hold bridgeheads and counterattack. Despite their inexperience, the Estonian units fought fiercely, motivated in part by the prospect of preventing a Soviet return to Estonia. Additional German support came from the 227th Infantry Division and specialist battalions, which reinforced weak points along the line. Fighting was especially fierce at the Krivisu bridgehead, south of Narva. Soviet troops managed to carve out a substantial lodgment there by mid-February, forcing the Germans into repeated counterattacks. Both sides suffered high casualties as the bridgehead changed hands multiple times. The Soviets poured reinforcements into the position, hoping to expand it into a launching point for a wider offensive. The Germans, however, concentrated artillery and reserves to contain it, preventing a breakout but unable to eliminate it entirely. This pattern of localized Soviet penetrations, followed by German countermeasures, characterized much of the fighting through February and March. Air power played a significant role during these first engagements. The Soviet Air Force supported ground operations with bombing raids against German strongpoints, while the Luftwaffe targeted Soviet supply columns and attempted to interdict crossings of the Narva River. Neither side achieved clear air superiority, and the result was a war of attrition in which both armies endured constant air harassment without decisive aerial control. Civilian populations near the front bore the brunt of these early battles. Estonian villages along the Narva River were destroyed by artillery and bombing, forcing thousands of inhabitants to flee westward. Many were caught in the crossfire between advancing Soviet forces and retreating Germans. Some Estonians were pressed into service by German units as laborers or auxiliaries, while others attempted to hide or escape the fighting altogether. For civilians, the first phase of the battle brought both displacement and the uncertainty of shifting occupations. Morale on both sides reflected the grinding nature of the fighting. Soviet soldiers faced the challenge of attacking fortified positions across difficult terrain, sustaining heavy losses without rapid breakthroughs. German and foreign SS troops, outnumbered but benefiting from strong defensive positions, took pride in holding their ground, but grew increasingly aware of the pressure mounting against them. Estonian conscripts faced a particularly difficult situation, caught between German demands and the looming return of Soviet rule. By late February, the front had stabilized into a tense standoff. The Soviets controlled several bridgeheads west of the Narva River, but had failed to break through into open terrain. The Germans had prevented a decisive collapse, but at the cost of continuous attrition. Both sides prepared for renewed offensives, aware that the battle for Narva was far from decided. The first engagements revealed the nature of the coming struggle. Not a rapid Soviet advance or a clean German stand, but a prolonged contest of endurance on a narrow front where geography, manpower, and political symbolism intertwined. As spring 1944 approached, the Battle of Narva entered a period of escalation and crisis. The Soviet High Command, determined to break through the German lines before the thaw, launched successive offensives to expand their bridgeheads and seize the city. The Germans, under constant pressure, reinforced their defenses with every available unit while contending with shortages of men and supplies. The conflict intensified along the narrow Narva front, creating one of the most concentrated battlefields of the Eastern Front. In March 1944, the Soviets mounted major attacks on the German positions surrounding Narva. The Second Shock Army, reinforced with fresh rifle divisions and tank brigades, attempted to push out from the Krivisu bridgehead south of the city. Simultaneously, the 59th Army struck northward along the river, hoping to encircle German defenders. Soviet artillery barrages preceded these assaults, with thousands of shells and Katyusha rockets falling on German trenches. In many sectors, the bombardments destroyed entire defensive lines before the infantry advanced. However, when the attacks followed, German units often reoccupied their shattered positions and repelled the assaults with close-range fire. The German response relied on carefully coordinated counterattacks. Felix Steiner's the 3rd SS Panzer Corps used mobile reserves from the Waffen-SS divisions Nordland and Nederland to launch local counterstrikes. These divisions, supplemented by the Estonian 20th SS Division, fought in small groups, striking at Soviet spearheads before they could consolidate. Casualties on both sides were severe. The Soviets lost thousands of men in repeated frontal attacks, while the Germans gradually exhausted their reserves. By mid-March, the German line still held, but at the cost of mounting attrition that threatened the long-term viability of the defense. Conditions on the battlefield added to the crisis. The thaw turned roads into rivers of mud, hampering movement of tanks, artillery, and supply columns. Soviet forces operating from bridgeheads struggled to bring heavy equipment across the Narva River on improvised pontoon bridges, many of which were destroyed by German artillery and air raids. The Germans, dependent on fragile supply lines running back to Estonia and Latvia, faced shortages of ammunition and fuel. The Luftwaffe attempted to relieve pressure by bombing Soviet positions, but its presence was limited by losses elsewhere and by Soviet fighters increasingly dominating the skies. The civilian population of Narva suffered heavily during this escalation. The city, once a prosperous Estonian town, was repeatedly bombed and shelled. In early March, Soviet air raids destroyed much of the old city, leaving tens of thousands homeless. German authorities evacuated civilians westward, but many remained trapped in the ruins. The destruction of Narva became symbolic. To the Soviets, it was the elimination of a German stronghold. To the Germans, it was further evidence of their determination to resist regardless of cost. For Estonians, the devastation represented both the suffering of their homeland and the uncertainty of what Soviet reoccupation would bring. Political tensions sharpened during this period. In Berlin, Hitler insisted that Narva be held at all costs, declaring it a fortress. This order compelled Steiner and his officers to maintain their positions even when tactical withdrawal might have preserved forces. In Moscow, Stalin and Stavka pressed Govorov to achieve decisive results in Estonia, believing that success there would hasten Finland's exit from the war and secure the northern flank for later offensives into the Baltic states. Both leaderships saw Narva as a point of prestige as well as strategy, further intensifying the battle. By the end of March 1944, the situation had reached a critical stage. The Soviets had expanded their bridgeheads, particularly at Crusade, but had not broken through the German main line. The Germans had contained the attacks, but at the price of high casualties and the destruction of much of Narva itself. Both sides prepared for further offensives as the spring thaw ended, setting the stage for the climactic battles of the summer. The escalation around Narva highlighted the limits of both armies. The Soviets' inability to achieve rapid breakthroughs, despite overwhelming strength, and the Germans' capacity to defend, but not to restore strategic initiative. The crisis had locked both sides into a war of attrition that would soon reach its peak. The summer of 1944 marked the peak of the Battle of Narva, when the fighting reached its highest intensity and both sides committed maximum effort to decide the fate of the front. After months of inconclusive assaults and attritional combat, the Soviet High Command prepared for a decisive blow, while the Germans concentrated their remaining strength to prevent a breakthrough that would open Estonia to Soviet occupation. The narrow Narva Isthmus became the scene of continuous battles where divisions were committed, destroyed, and rebuilt under relentless pressure. By June, Stavka concentrated the 2nd Shock Army and 59th Army for a renewed offensive. Reinforcements included additional rifle divisions, tank brigades, and heavy artillery, raising Soviet strength in the sector to over 13,000 men with more than 2,000 guns and mortars. Soviet air units massed hundreds of aircraft to support the ground assault. Their objective was not only to capture Narva, but also to drive west toward Rockvere and Tallinn, threatening to cut off German Army Group North entirely. On the German side, Felix Steiner's the 3rd SS Panzer Corps prepared for the onslaught with about 5,000 troops, including the 11th SS Division Nordland, the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, Estonian, and the SS Volunteer Brigade Nederland. These units, supported by Wehrmacht infantry divisions and artillery battalions, entrenched along a fortified line east of Narva and on the so-called Tannenberg Line, defensive positions constructed in the Sinimäed Hills further west. German engineers built bunkers, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles, knowing that their survival depended on terrain and prepared defenses. The Soviet offensive began on 24th of July, 1944, with one of the heaviest artillery bombardments of the Eastern Front in the Baltic Theater. For hours, thousands of shells and rockets pounded German positions. Entire trenches and bunkers were obliterated, and casualties mounted before the infantry and tanks advanced. Soviet rifle divisions surged across the battlefield, aiming to overwhelm German defenders by sheer weight of numbers. In the northern sector, Soviet units succeeded in breaking through several German positions and reached the approaches to the Sinimäed Hills. The Germans countered with immediate local counterattacks. Waffen-SS units, though reduced in strength, launched repeated assaults to retake lost ground. Estonian troops of the 20th Division fought with determination, seeing the battle as a struggle for their homeland. The Nordland Division, with Scandinavian volunteers, bore the brunt of fighting on the left flank, while Dutch and Flemish contingents from Nederland manned key strongpoints. Despite their efforts, Soviet advances pushed the Germans back toward the Tannenberg Line by late July. The climax came during the battles for the Sinimäed Hills between 25 July and 10 August 1944. These hills, dominating the surrounding terrain, became the focal point of the struggle. Soviet forces launched wave after wave of assaults, committing entire divisions in frontal attacks against fortified slopes. The Germans concentrated artillery and reserves to hold the line, turning the hills into a killing ground. Casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that Soviet losses in these assaults numbered tens of thousands, while German defenders also suffered heavily, with some battalions reduced to a fraction of their strength. Air operations intensified the struggle. Soviet bombers repeatedly struck German supply lines and rear areas, while the Luftwaffe, though diminished, provided close support with dive bombers and fighters. Neither side achieved clear air superiority, but both inflicted damage on enemy concentrations and supply networks. The battle became a contest of endurance, with artillery dominating the battlefield and infantry assaults grinding forward and backward over the same ridges. Civilian suffering reached new levels during this peak. Narva, already devastated by earlier bombardments, was almost completely destroyed. Villages across northeastern Estonia were caught in the fighting, leading to mass displacement. Thousands of Estonian civilians fled westward with retreating German units, fearing reprisals when the Soviets returned. Others were evacuated forcibly or conscripted into labor service by both sides. By mid-August, the Soviet command acknowledged the difficulty of achieving a rapid breakthrough at Narva. Despite massive losses, German forces continued to hold the Tannenberg Line, preventing the Soviets from cutting off Army Group North. The peak of the campaign thus revealed both the intensity of Soviet determination and the tenacity of German defenses. For weeks, the Sinimäed Hills had been contested in some of the bloodiest fighting of the Baltic theater. And while the Soviets made territorial gains, the Germans preserved their main defensive line. The summer battles marked the high point of the Narva campaign, after which the initiative would gradually shift as the broader strategic situation forced the Germans to withdraw. By late August 1944, the Battle of Narva entered a phase of resistance and adaptation, as the ferocious clashes at the Sinimäed Hills gave way to an uneasy stalemate. Both sides, drained by the peak summer battles, shifted their focus from large-scale offensives to sustaining their positions and preparing for the next phase of operations. What defined this stage was not sweeping maneuvers, but the ability of armies, commanders, and civilians to adapt to the immense losses and logistical strain imposed by months of relentless combat. For the Germans, resistance was centered on holding the Tannenberg Line. The Sinimäed Hills provided natural defensive advantages, and engineers reinforced the position with minefields, barbed wire, and newly constructed bunkers. Units of the WW2 Panzer Corps, reduced in strength after July's fighting, reorganized into smaller battle groups. Some regiments counted fewer than 1,000 men, yet they continued to man extensive defensive fronts. Reinforcements trickled in, but shortages of equipment and ammunition forced reliance on captured Soviet weapons and improvisation in fortifications. Commanders like Felix Steiner emphasized flexible defense, relying on counterattacks by small mobile groups to repel Soviet probes. Waffen-SS foreign volunteer divisions showed resilience despite their losses. The 20th Estonian Division, fighting on home soil, integrated new conscripts and reorganized depleted battalions. Their motivation drew partly from fear of Soviet reoccupation and partly from national sentiment, though desertions also occurred as casualties mounted and morale fluctuated. The Nordland Division, with its Scandinavian Corps, and the Netherland Brigade from Dutch and Flemish volunteers likewise absorbed replacements, but at declining quality. German propaganda continued to present the Narva front as a European crusade, though in practice the unit struggled with exhaustion and attrition. The Soviets adapted by altering their operational approach. After failing to break the Tannenberg Line with direct assaults, the Leningrad front shifted to attritional tactics, using artillery bombardments, raids, and probing attacks to wear down the German defense. Soviet rifle divisions, many rebuilt after suffering enormous losses in July, dug extensive trench systems opposite the Sinimäed Hills, preparing for prolonged positional warfare. Reinforcements arrived steadily, though Stavka allocated greater priority to the Belarusian and Ukrainian fronts during this period. This meant that Narva remained active but secondary compared to larger offensives elsewhere. Soviet adaptation also included increased use of partisan and irregular forces. Partisan groups operated in the forests of Estonia, attacking German supply convoys and communication lines. These actions, though not decisive, forced the Germans to divert troops to rear area security, stretching already limited manpower. Soviet propaganda, aimed at Estonian civilians, emphasized liberation and portrayed Narva as a symbol of returning Soviet authority. At the same time, fears of deportations and reprisals led many Estonians to remain ambivalent or hostile, complicating Soviet recruitment efforts. Civilians bore the heaviest toll during this phase. Narva, reduced to ruins, was almost entirely evacuated, its remaining population displaced westward by German authorities or scattered into the countryside. Villages across northeastern Estonia were depopulated as families fled the front, or were pressed into labor constructing defenses. Thousands of Estonians sought escape across the Baltic Sea to Finland or Sweden, beginning a refugee movement that would grow in scale later in 1944. For those who remained, survival meant adapting to scarcity, air raids, and the constant threat of shifting occupation. Psychological strain shaped the experience of soldiers and civilians alike. German troops, increasingly aware of the larger defeats suffered by the Wehrmacht in Belarus and Ukraine, struggled with declining morale, yet local attachment and defensive advantages sustained their will to resist. Soviet soldiers, though bolstered by growing confidence in ultimate victory, faced the sobering reality of the high casualties inflicted in July. Veterans of the Cinemide battles carried the memory of costly assaults that had yielded only partial gains, making the prospect of further offensives daunting. Innovation emerged out of necessity. German units experimented with camouflage to conceal bunkers and artillery from Soviet observation, while Soviet engineers improved bridging equipment and developed new tactics for assaulting fortified slopes. Both sides increased reliance on artillery. For the Soviets, mass barrages softened German defenses. For the Germans, concentrated defensive fire served as a force multiplier, compensating for fewer troops. By early September, the Narva front had settled into a tense equilibrium. The Germans clung to their fortified line, determined to hold Estonia as long as possible, while the Soviets consolidated their positions and prepared for future offensives. Resistance and adaptation defined this stage, a shift from dramatic assaults to prolonged endurance, where survival hinged on ingenuity, discipline, and the ability to cope with staggering losses. The battle for Narva had not yet ended, but it was clear that its outcome would be shaped less by individual attacks than by the cumulative exhaustion of the forces engaged. The turning point of the Battle of Narva came in September 1944, when broader developments on the Eastern Front forced Germany to reconsider its position in the Baltic. The Soviets had launched Operation Bagration in June, destroying Army Group Center in Belarus and driving deep into the Baltics. With Soviet spearheads pushing toward Riga and the Gulf of Riga, the risk of Army Group North being cut off became acute. What had begun as a localized struggle around the Narva River was now part of a larger encirclement threat, and strategic imperatives dictated a German withdrawal despite the resilience of the defenses at the Tannenberg Line. For months, German and Waffen-SS troops had held their ground against Soviet offensives, particularly during the costly battles in July and August at the Cinemide Hills. By September, however, Soviet progress further south meant that continued defense of Narva risked isolation. The Red Army's Second Baltic Front pushed westward through Latvia, while the Leningrad Front maintained pressure in Estonia. Stavka recognized that instead of costly frontal assaults on the heavily fortified Narva Isthmus, it could achieve its goals by outflanking the German position from the south. This shift in operational conditions transformed the balance of the campaign. The German High Command, under pressure from Hitler to hold ground but aware of the danger, faced a critical decision. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group North, argued for a withdrawal to new defensive positions in central Estonia to avoid encirclement. On the 16th of September 1944, orders were given for the German 3rd SS Panzer Corps to begin evacuating Narva and retreating westward to new lines near Tallinn and the Pärnu River. The withdrawal was conducted under constant Soviet pressure, with rearguard actions fought by units of the Nordland and Estonian divisions to delay pursuit. The Soviets seized the opportunity to advance. On 17th of September, the Red Army launched a general offensive along the Narva front. The Second Shock Army broke through weakened German positions, and Soviet rifle divisions crossed the Narva River in force. By 20th September, Soviet troops entered Narva itself. The city, already devastated by earlier bombardments, was abandoned by German forces and taken under Soviet control. Estonian civilians who had not evacuated faced immediate reimposition of Soviet rule, while thousands who feared deportation fled west with retreating German columns or across the Baltic Sea. For the Germans, the retreat from Narva was a turning point that symbolized the collapse of their defensive strategy in the Baltic. After months of holding the line, they were compelled to abandon a position of tactical strength because of strategic defeats elsewhere. The multinational character of the defense, emphasized in propaganda as a European crusade, ended in withdrawal and dispersal. Many foreign volunteer units were redeployed to other fronts or absorbed into collapsing German formations, retreating through the Baltics. For the Estonian 20th SS Division, the retreat meant abandoning their homeland to Soviet reoccupation, a moment of profound consequence for those who had fought under German command. The Soviet capture of Narva marked not only a military success, but also a political statement. It demonstrated the irreversible momentum of the Red Army in 1944 and its capacity to reclaim territories lost in 1941. For Estonia, it meant the end of a brief period under German occupation and the beginning of renewed Soviet control, which would be consolidated in the following weeks with the capture of Tallinn and the rest of the country. For civilians, the turning point was experienced as another upheaval, evacuation, flight, or forced adaptation to a changing regime. The collapse of the Narva front highlighted the interplay between local endurance and broader strategic realities. German troops had resisted for months at enormous cost, but events on other sectors of the Eastern Front determined the outcome. The Soviet advance into Estonia was no longer contingent on frontal assaults at Narva, but on the ability to outflank German defenses through Latvia and central Estonia. This turning point shifted the balance irreversibly, ensuring that the German presence in Estonia would soon come to an end, and that the Red Army would secure the entire Baltic region in the final months of 1944. The aftermath of the German withdrawal from Narva in September 1944 unfolded rapidly as Soviet forces advanced across Estonia, and the remnants of Army Group North retreated toward Latvia. The reoccupation of Narva by the Red Army was followed almost immediately by operations to capture Tallinn and secure the Estonian coastline, while German and Waffen-SS units fought delaying actions to cover their retreat. For soldiers and civilians alike, this phase marked a decisive shift: the end of German control in Estonia and the consolidation of Soviet authority over the Baltic states. In military terms, the withdrawal was organized but costly. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps conducted rearguard actions along the Narva-Tallinn line, using small battle groups to delay Soviet pursuit. Units from the Nordland Division, the Estonian 20th Division, and elements of the Nederland Brigade fought a series of engagements in forests and marshes, sacrificing ground in exchange for time. Their efforts allowed German columns and supply convoys to reach evacuation points on the Baltic coast. By late September, German forces began embarking from Tallinn and other ports, retreating to Latvia and the Courland Peninsula, where they would later be encircled in the so-called Courland Pocket. For the Soviets, the rapid advance was a major operational success. On 22 September 1944, Soviet troops entered Tallinn, completing the recapture of Estonia's capital. Within days, Soviet units controlled the entire Estonian coastline, cutting off German naval bases and securing the Gulf of Finland. This gave the Soviet Navy greater freedom to operate in the Baltic Sea and removed a long-standing threat to Leningrad. The Soviet Second Shock Army and supporting formations continued southward, pressing the Germans into Latvia and aiming to sever their retreat routes. The consequences for Estonia's population were profound. Tens of thousands of civilians fled westward with retreating German units, fearing reprisals or deportations under Soviet rule. Many crossed the Baltic Sea to Finland or Sweden, forming the core of the Estonian wartime refugee diaspora. Others attempted to evacuate with German naval convoys, often under attack by Soviet submarines and aircraft. Those who remained behind faced immediate re-Sovietization. Soviet authorities re-established political control, reinstated collectivization policies, and initiated security sweeps to identify collaborators. Thousands were arrested, and many were deported in subsequent years. For Estonian soldiers of the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, the aftermath was particularly harsh. Those who retreated with German forces became part of the collapsing defensive lines in Latvia, where they fought until the end of the war. Others who were captured by the Soviets were treated as traitors, with many sent to labor camps in Siberia. The division's role in the German defense of Narva ensured it would remain a controversial symbol in post-war Estonian memory. The destruction of Narva itself epitomized the human and cultural cost of the campaign. Once one of Estonia's most historic cities, Narva was left in ruins after months of bombardment and fighting. When Soviet authorities re-established control, they demolished what little remained of the old town, reshaping it into a new Soviet urban center. For Estonians, the loss of Narva's heritage became a lasting reminder of the war's devastation. In broader strategic terms, the withdrawal from Narva and the Soviet occupation of Estonia marked the end of German influence in the country and the definitive incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet sphere. For Germany, the failure to hold Narva underscored the weakening capacity of Army Group North to resist Soviet advances. The retreat to Latvia was a temporary reprieve, but it signaled the collapse of German defenses in the entire region. For the Soviets, the capture of Estonia consolidated their position on the northern flank of the Eastern Front and secured critical bases for operations in the Baltic Sea. It also reinforced Stalin's political objective of reabsorbing the Baltic republics into the Soviet Union. The aftermath of Narva was thus not only a military event, but also a turning point in the political future of the region, shaping its trajectory for decades to come. The legacy of the Battle of Narva and the European Crusade narrative of 1944 remains one of the most complex and controversial episodes of the Second World War in the Baltic region. Militarily, politically, and culturally, the campaign left enduring marks on the participants and on the societies whose territory became the battlefield. Its significance can only be understood by considering the long-term consequences for Germany, the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, and the wider European memory of the war. For Germany, Narva represented both a tactical success and a strategic failure. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS managed to hold off numerically superior Soviet forces for more than 6 months, inflicting high casualties and delaying the Red Army's advance toward the Baltic coast. Yet the eventual retreat in September 1944 highlighted the impossibility of sustaining defense in the face of overwhelming Soviet strength and the collapse of German positions elsewhere. Narva entered German military historiography as a symbol of determined resistance, but also as evidence of how Hitler's insistence on holding fortress cities drained manpower and contributed little to the overall strategic picture. The Soviet Union interpreted the battle as part of its broader narrative of liberation and reconquest. The Red Army's capture of Narva and subsequent occupation of Estonia in September 1944 were framed as victories that secured Leningrad from future threats and re-established Soviet control over the Baltic region. In Soviet historiography, the focus was placed on the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the significance of breaking through German defenses in a strategically vital corridor. Less attention was given to the heavy casualties suffered during repeated assaults on the Tannenberg Line, or to the local population's mixed reception of Soviet rule. For Estonia, Narva's legacy was deeply ambivalent. The city itself was destroyed, its historic center leveled by artillery and bombing. Tens of thousands of Estonians were caught between the two powers, with many conscripted into the Waffen-SS by German authorities and others drafted into the Red Army as Soviet forces advanced. The population endured successive occupations, deportations, and mass displacement. After the war, Narva was rebuilt as a Soviet city, with little attempt to restore its pre-war architecture. The experience of 1944 became part of Estonia's divided memory. For some, it was the moment of resisting Soviet reoccupation alongside German forces. For others, it was the moment of liberation from Nazi rule, though one that ushered in decades of Soviet repression. The foreign volunteers of the Waffen-SS divisions left another legacy that continues to provoke debate. The presence of Scandinavian, Dutch, Flemish, and Belgian contingents was used by Nazi propaganda to present Narva as a European crusade against Bolshevism. After the war, this portrayal was discredited as part of the ideological machinery of the Third Reich. However, for some veterans and their supporters, the battle was later remembered as an expression of pan-European anti-Soviet resistance. This legacy complicated post-war narratives in Western Europe, where collaboration with Nazi Germany remained a sensitive issue, and in the Baltic states, where the conscription of locals into German formations was remembered as both coercion and a desperate attempt to defend national soil. On the civilian level, Narva exemplified the destruction of cultural heritage during the war. The centuries-old city, once a symbol of Estonian history and architecture, was reduced to rubble and never fully restored. For the displaced populations, the war created lasting refugee communities in Finland, Sweden, and beyond, while those who remained lived under Soviet rule that brought mass arrests, collectivization, and political repression. In broader historical debates, Narva illustrates the intersection of local and global dimensions of the war. It was simultaneously a German defensive battle, a Soviet offensive, an Estonian national tragedy, and a stage for multinational Waffen-SS propaganda. For military historians, it serves as an example of how geography, ideology, and attrition shaped campaigns in secondary theaters. For political historians, it underscores how battles on the Eastern Front influenced the post-war order in Eastern Europe, fixing Soviet control over the Baltics for nearly half a century. Today, the memory of Narva remains contested. In Estonia, commemorations of those who fought on different sides reflect the divided legacy of 1944. In Russia, the battle is celebrated as part of the Red Army's triumph in liberating the Baltic states. In Western Europe, the presence of foreign SS volunteers continues to raise questions about collaboration, ideology, and the complexities of wartime choices. The legacy of Narva, therefore, is not confined to the battlefield of 1944, but extends into debates about memory, identity, and the meaning of the war in Europe. It stands as a reminder of how one campaign, fought on a narrow strip of land, encapsulated the vast and often contradictory forces that shaped the Second World War and its aftermath.